So, September's upon us once again, and I reckon now is a good time to take a look at 10 jobs which you can be getting up to this month, ranging from your must-dos to some, I'd probably say, more interesting ones which you're yet to hear about. We're definitely now in that crossover window between summer and autumn, so let's get on with these before it's too late. That means you're going to want to watch this whole video to make sure you don't miss out on this opportunity. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay then, I reckon we should start this video with potentially one of the most important ones for this month, and that is spring bulb planting. I love it when this time of year comes around because you know when you get those bulbs planted come next spring and those darker mornings are upon us, you just draw back the curtains and look outside and you see those splashes of colour coming up through, you know, your raised beds or your flower beds or the lawn or wherever it may be. It's just the best. So today we'll be sowing some daffodils. For me, I'd say they're the best spring flower, not just because they're the flower of Wales, but also because of those nice, delicate yellow petals which they produce. They just look amazing in the spring sunshine. Although, why not let me know in the comments what's your favourite spring bulb, because for me it's daffodils, but it's going to be different for you potentially, so please do let me know in the comments and I'd love to hear. When it actually comes to planting your bulbs, for daffodils and really many of the other bulbs, you want to aim to plant it about 2 to 3 times the depth of the actual bulb depth itself. So if your bulb's 5 centimetres deep, then you're going to want to plant it at about 10 to 15 centimetres ish. It's just that if you plant it too shallow, sometimes, you know, the bulb will come up too early, and then if it's still too cold, it could just die straight back. But conversely, if it's too deep, it would come up and then it might have to put too much energy into actually coming up through the soil to then, you know, you might not get any flowers at all, which is obviously not what we want. Now, this next one might seem like it's going against all the instincts you have as a gardener, but trust me, it might just save your crop. If you've not had access to a polytunnel, a cold frame, or a greenhouse of any sort, and you're growing tomatoes, yes, you may have had some success so far, but as those days continue to get shorter and colder, the rate of growth and the rate at which your tomatoes ripen is obviously going to go down, and the rate at which they ripen will just become lower and lower and lower and lower. You get the point. Anyways, to try and maximise the amount of tomatoes you can get, a really cool trick you can do is to cut them before they're actually ripe. So this could be when they're still green or when they're orange about to turn red. You just snip the vine off and then you can place them on a windowsill, and that will then still encourage the tomatoes to actually ripen. And by taking off this big bunch of tomatoes or vine of tomatoes, you'll then have all this extra energy which the plant can then put back into the other tomatoes on the plant and cause them to ripen too. It's a win-win. This next one is sure to be something you definitely have not heard about yet. Be honest, how many of us sometimes just neglect the lawn and, you know, leave a lawn to be a lawn? I mean, they should be fine, right? Well, they probably will be, but you want to have a nice, luscious green lawn. One thing you can do to help them at this time of year is to scarify your lawn. Now, if you're like me a couple of years ago and going, what on earth is scarifying? It's pretty simple. It just involves taking a rake and raking it over the top of the lawn. This then causes all the dead bits of grass to be swept up from it. 1, it gives you lots more composting green matter, and 2, it actually lets in more air and more light into the lawn, obviously allowing the healthy ones to thrive more. Unfortunately for all of us, now is the perfect time of year to do it. Not only does it make your lawn healthier, but it makes you healthier too, because it's a proper killer on your stomach muscles. Only if it's done right though, but to be honest, you can't really go wrong with it. Again, as most of our summer flowers begin to come to an end, you'll start to see little seed heads appearing where those flowers once were. Of course, these can just be left on the plant and, you know, like in the wild, these will naturally disperse themselves and probably germinate where you don't necessarily want them to. Because really, who wants marigolds growing up in the middle of the driveway, no matter how interesting it might look? So what I like to do is to just come out with a bowl and a pair of secateurs and just cut the stem and sprinkle the seeds into the bowl by rubbing the seed heads through my hands. Usually I like to do this with a mix of flowers, so, you know, I'll take the calendulas, some of the cosmos and the marigolds and create this nice mix that I can then just scatter out over the flower beds, and it'll create a lovely wild looking display. If you want to know more about how to harvest your own seeds, I'll leave a link in the video description so you can watch an in-depth video which we made earlier on in the season on it. Harvesting seeds is one of my favourite things at this time of the year because I know if I put in the time now to harvest them, I'll save myself lots of money come the spring when, you've got to do all the inevitable seed buying and everything. And it's just a really good way, of increasing your self-sufficiency in a way, I guess, have everything coming from your own space. It's a really good feeling. So we've looked at a couple of things which we can be getting up to at this time of the month. And so far, we've not talked about what we could potentially sow. So let's do that now. Obviously, if you're in a more temperate climate like myself, what we can actually get sown now is considerably less than 2 months ago. But that's not going to stop us sowing some really tasty crops which we can enjoy over the winter and into next spring and even summer. One of my favourites to sow at this time of the year is kale. I'll tell you an interesting story about this. Last year, at this very time, I sowed a crop of kale. And despite it being in the ground from, September, no protection, all the way until next spring, I was still harvesting tasty leaves from it up until a couple of weeks ago. So, if you want something which is definitely going to last and produce you loads of tasty leaves, kale is a good one to do at this time of the year. Obviously, when it comes to sowing them, you can sow them into a seed tray, or you can just get them put straight in the ground. For me personally, at this time of year, I like to just get them straight in the ground and know they're on the way. So I'll sprinkle them a bit more densely than, I intend to have them. And then once they start to come up, I can either transplant out the bigger ones to give them a bit more space. Also, you can multi-sow them if you want. So that's just doing little clumps and then you'll get lots appearing from the same place. That's a good way of maximising your space as well. But then also I like to just remove any of the really weak ones and, you can compost them and just get rid of them. Remember though, if you're sowing seeds, it's always best to water the soil before you put the seeds in, just so you don't dislodge the seeds or make them go too deep or in the completely wrong place. It's just a good way of going about things. An easy one to do at this time of the year is just to manage your water levels in the garden. With obviously the changing climate, you could have gone from not having much rain at all to now seeing more rain than you used to. And even though the rain might be falling, it might not necessarily be falling heavy enough to actually infiltrate the soil. So it's always good just to use a dibber or your finger if it is the dibber, to just check the soil a few centimetres down just to make sure it is damp enough and that the water is getting into the soil. Because even if the top layer of the soil does look wet, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be water down where the roots are. It's an easy one to do, but quite an important one if you don't want your seeds to dry out too much. Now, I don't know how many of you like your houseplants, but for me, I love them just as much as I do the plants in the garden. So to make sure that they stay nice and healthy at this time of the year, it's a good idea just to keep up with a weekly fertiliser for them. Normally, if you look on the back of concentrated fertiliser bottles, it'll tell you the ratio of how much water you need to the liquid feed, if that's what you're using. I always like to use rainwater with mine from the water butt, because rainwater actually has a slightly more acidic pH compared to tap water, and that is more ideal for even your houseplants, which have obviously come from outside. Like myself, I hope you're still harvesting tons of tasty vegetables from the garden. So I guess that's one which should feature on the list. As we know, the growth is slowing down, obviously at this time of the year. So continue to make the most of, your courgettes, your tomatoes, your peppers, everything which wants that warmer climate. But again, don't feel like that's the end of the growing season, because there's still so much we can get in the ground. For example, many varieties of lettuces can go in right now. And to be honest, crops like lettuces, rocket, your salad leaves, do actually prefer the cooler months for growing in. Usually when I'm sowing these, I just direct sow them straight into the ground. I just use a dibber to draw a nice drill and then sprinkle them into that trench. Again, like your other crops, these can, be thinned out if necessary, just to give the plants a bit more space. Also, if you want to give them a bit more protection from, the outside elements, which they'll probably have to face a lot more of now, you can cover them in a cloche or a mesh. All these things will help to, increase the temperature under there and also protect them from things like your slugs, your snails, and your cats potentially. Not always true though. I've had experience myself. So I guess I can say if you do have cats, it's actually a good idea to maybe use some chicken wire. I've found that to be the most successful thing, because no matter how much they try and dig through that, they're not getting in. And last but not least, weeding. Yay, we love this one. Okay, Okay, maybe not. Although some people do say it can be quite therapeutic, which I back. Although this one isn't strictly for this month, it's always good to keep on top of it. And you know, given that it always comes back, it's a good thing to include in this month list. Actually, I've found quite a lot in the grass recently, so to try and get those out, a good thing I like to do is to just use a knife and basically push it down into the soil and cut out the bottom of the root, and it's actually then quite easy to pull that and the rest of it out. It seems to work quite well with keeping them suppressed, so I guess I'll just keep having to do it until I've suppressed every single weed in the whole world. And there we have it, 10 essential jobs for your garden in September. I hope this video was useful for you and showed you some common things which you definitely need to be doing, and you know, the more unusual ones which you're probably yet to hear. And if you want to check out another thing which you can be doing in the garden right now at this time, why not click here to find out. Thanks for watching everyone. Please leave a like and subscribe to the channel as it helps me out so much in making these videos, and I guess see you soon.